Okay, evening everybody, and welcome to another one of our joint webinars from across the region. Tonight on the panel is all the lead officers from across the East area, and Matt Blakeley has kindly joined us again from the ECB to help us go through the guidelines. This one is a webinar, so obviously as participants you're behind, so you're all muted, we won't be able to take questions, but there are Q&A boxes down the bottom if you'd like to put any comments and questions there, and if we haven't gone through them in the webinar, we'll then try and pick up 2 or 3 of them at the end, and if we don't manage to get through all of them or they start to be specific, then we'll make sure one of the lead officers will follow up with you at the end. Again, it's another great turnout. We're up over 100 people on the webinar again, which just shows the passion and the interest in the game and trying to all help us work together in terms of supporting the games in our local community as we go forward. So I'm going to pass on to Matt now to start off. Over to you, Matt.
Cheers, Dan. And just echoing Dan's, thanks for everybody taking the time and joining us tonight. I think it's much more exciting time than it was a few weeks ago. There's very much a positive vibe around about getting back towards cricket. But I think this first slide just sums up that cautious approach of, whilst it is getting a little bit closer and steps have been taken to allow groups to come back together, I think it's just worth reminding that we are in a significant public health situation, and the overriding kind of priorities around people's safety and keeping people safe. So everything that we say tonight is about how we can support cricket to come back and allow people to come and enjoy the game that we all love, but just having at the centre of it just this government kind of advice, really. So from an ECB perspective, our conversations with government are very much taking a lead on making sure government are comfortable with steps that we're taking, that we're not overstretching ourselves or doing anything that we shouldn't be, to allow us to come back when we can come back as a game and play what we class as the traditional game that we should be playing at this time of year, that it's done safely and with the government's backing. So all your help and support on these stages and these steps that we're taking is hugely appreciated, and just bear with us. It may not seem that we're moving very quickly, but we're trying to do it as safely and to protect the people that are involved in the game. Dan, can you go on to the next slide, mate? So here's just a couple of slides of information we shared with the county board. So just reiterating to the network, really, from an ECB perspective, we want to make sure that the public's protected first and foremost, and they're the people that use our facilities and our clubs and that make up our volunteer network that run the game for us during the summer. We also want to make sure that the game's sustained and we keep the lights on, and through all this that we're working in partnership. The bottom slide shows a little bit of a journey that we're on at the moment, and at each of those stages, you can see at the bottom of those columns is a blue box around guidance and clarity. So every time we think about changing or we hear changes from government, we just want to make sure we've got the right guidance and clarity from DCMS and from the Chief Medical Officer's office in Westminster, or virtually in Westminster at the moment, and that we've got that real clear guidance so we can allow people to move forward. And we're very much moving now from a phase of protecting the game and looking after the game to preparing to get ready to play. And that yellow box just shows that we're in between those two strands. So whilst there's some movement, we still need to look after protecting the game, but we are getting ready and getting a bit more excited and optimistic about the future and playing the game shortly. Dan, if you click onto the next slide, please. So this just shows some of our thinking. So this is a little bit confidential at the moment, so we'll be sharing this this roadmap or a version of this roadmap with the public later on this week. So, but being on this webinar, I wanted to share kind of our thinking and where we've come from. So from full lockdown in step 1, where we were several weeks ago, we've started seeing those gradual steps to unlocking. So step 3 in the middle is where we're at today in terms of groups of 6 and being able to coach. The next stage we anticipate will be kind of an expanded version of that, and we're just working through all the different elements that sit within there in terms of adapted gameplay, how clubs can bring juniors back onto their fields safely, how we can get some of the structures around that, how we can get some shorter format and some adjusted games happening in clubland before we then step into what we class as unrestricted play, which is 11-a-side league cricket, which I think we all hope will be coming sooner rather than later. But the caveat with all of this is, because of that public health situation, whilst we're looking at step 4 optimistically, there's a reality that in the next few weeks we could always be moving back towards step 2 or step 1, and we've got to have that in the back of our minds as a game, that whilst we're optimistic and when the sun's shining outside it's easy to be optimistic, the health agenda that sits behind this and the agenda from government is about protecting people's lives ultimately. So whilst we all want to go and play cricket, and that's really positive, I think just having in the back of people's minds that whilst we could move forward in the next few weeks, we could just as easily move backwards. And it's one of the reasons that the ECB has been a little bit reluctant in sharing any sort of journey like this, because it's not a one-way journey. It's a journey that's going to have steps forward and backwards over the next coming months. And that depends on so many factors that are outside of our control. But just to give comfort to the people on the call today, that as a game, we've got those plans and we're working through what that looks like. But the nervousness, as I say, is that this could be whilst a positive forward journey, it could also be going backwards at some point, and we've just got to have that in the back of our minds. I'm going to pass over to Rob now. I think it's going to take us through the guidance in a little bit more detail, and I'll pick up any questions later on.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So we've obviously got the outdoor cricket facilities there, and most of those are obviously self-explanatory from the one-to-one coaching that we had previously that was sent out, I think, just over a week ago. So we talked about, obviously, do not use your facility if obviously a member of your household has symptoms. I think that's a fairly obvious one. I think the thing around sort of washing your hands and the health and hygiene, Sam's going to come on to in a moment. So if I just quickly pass over to Sam, he'll go through that next slide that Dan has very kindly brought up. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Apologies, for some reason I can't get on camera, but you can hear me hopefully. So I'll crack on with a few bits just around health and hygiene for me. Firstly, just talking about symptoms. Anyone obviously with showing symptoms leading up to a session should follow the government advice and of course stay at home. And following that, after a session, through the booking system, it's hopefully clear that any individuals that do develop any symptoms, they must contact a club official to make them aware that they're showing some symptoms. That enables the club to be able to track and trace using that system of booking, and that ensures that both the appropriate ratios are adhered to leading up to a session, but also following that session, the club are able to look back on which individuals were using the nets at specific times, so that tracing can take place that's necessary. Hand hygiene is still really important, especially in scenarios where equipment is being shared, which I think Rob's going to allude to in his next slide. Where possible, encourage groups and individuals to bring your own hand sanitizer and wipes to support good practice relating to hygiene at your clubs. And finally, similar to the original guidance that is sent out, it's sort of upon the clubs to decide whether or not they feel obliged to open their facilities for up to groups of 6. If they don't feel comfortable to do so, then of course they do not have to. You may wish to remain closed completely, or only have one-to-ones, family groups in the nets, or limiting training to a specific area of your club. So you might just want to run outfield training or perhaps some fitness sessions. Slide 7, on to you, Rob.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so the first thing is obviously the clear net gap and cages and middles and stuff like that. And I think we want to break it down into 2 groups. So you've obviously got your juniors. Obviously, if you're running junior sessions, you must have a lead coach on site and obviously looking after a group. If you've then got subsequent groups of obviously 5 players, because the coaches count as a player, you can have, for example, a CSW working with another group, but ensuring that you adhere to the guidelines that Sam's just touched upon about obviously the social distancing and things like that. In terms of adults, whilst the coach isn't mandatory, you'll still need a club representative on site, just to make sure that obviously the procedures the club have put in place are obviously being adhered to. I think some of the considerations, a lot of the focus has been around of the actual playing and how that would kind of work within clubs. I'd also ask clubs to consider, about the sort of the toilets and the parking. So whilst it'd be great if we could have, 50, 60, 70, 100 kids on the outfield, taking place in their little groups of 6, you need to remember, obviously, at some stage they might need access to toilets. How's that going to work? Obviously, you're going to have parents turning up in their cars. Car parks can be a bit restrictive at cricket grounds. So just take that into consideration. So whilst you might have a big field out there, just think about how many children realistically and people on site you could have that could safely adhere to obviously all the guidelines have been touched upon. I think the other thing is around obviously the parents as well, is it's very important obviously that parents, if you know a net session is being taken place, obviously their child is active on the outfield, that the parents are able to watch from a safe distance. And you might want to have obviously an area, if it's a one-to-one coaching that was talked about last week, or obviously, you know, parents can stay in their cars if they can still see what's going on. And I know that Phil's going to bring up obviously the safeguarding element later in this session. When we're talking about obviously nets and stuff like that, I think one of the other things to consider is that, you know, balls can be hit out of the nets as well. And, you know, if you've got a nice flat outfield, then the ball can travel a long distance and might be inadvertently picked up by another group and obviously thrown back. So, you know, think about, you know, could you have a little safety net up that could act as a barrier to stop the ball being hit away from the group that you're actually working with? So little things like that could easily make a big difference. We talked about signage as well. So not only do the players need to know where they're going and if you've got a one-way system and stuff like that, but also the parents as well. So, you know, look for any pinch points, you know, how you're going to sort of cover that and manage that situation. And I think the signage really just help reinforce the club reps and coaches that are on site, just to say, as a club, this is what we're looking to try and do. And if you can obviously, you know, put that guidance out to your members that are using the facilities beforehand, then even better. The last bit is probably one of the most important ones, is around equipment. The recommendation is that obviously, you know, wherever possible, players bring their own equipment. Now, we are realistic and appreciate that on occasions that's not possible. So if in those scenarios where, you know, coach has got to maybe share some, you know, the equipment, whether it's, you know, balls and stuff like that, coaches can maybe use 6 balls for one player and then obviously rotate them round, or make sure that obviously sanitisation, so, you know, all equipment is thoroughly cleaned in between sessions before and after use, just to make sure that that can be done. I think when you're running a net session is that the batter, if a coach is doing throwdowns, the coach will need to wear obviously a mitt and a glove to field the ball, and then obviously can throw those to the batter for them to have a go at hitting. The batter would normally return the ball either by kicking it back or obviously with tapping it back gently with your bat. Bowlers, the ideal once again is that bowlers use their own ball, because obviously it reduces the risk of obviously having to share equipment. But once again, if it has to be done, then please just consider, you know, your sanitisation process and how that may work. Ultimately, you know, a good risk assessment beforehand will ensure that you've got all the measures in place to make sure that something works. But I also say, if you've run a session, then don't be afraid to review it afterwards and just say, yeah, you know, 99% of it went well, but actually in hindsight, it'd be good if we just tweaked a little bit of the procedure to make sure it's even better next time. So don't sort of be steadfast that you've got a procedure in place and that's how it's going to be for the next sort of 2 or 3 weeks, however long it is. And that's really it as far as sort of equipment is concerned. So Dan, I don't know if you want to take on to the next slide, please.
Cheers, Rob. Thanks for highlighting a number of things there. I think it's really important just to stress something that Rob picked up at the start of his previous slide. And it's something that us, as anyone running any session, whether it be juniors or adults, really making sure that we do adhere to the ECB Safe Hands guidance at all times. And that's really clear whether we're doing net sessions or whether we're doing small groups out on the outfield. And really making sure that we have got our qualified coaches, making sure we've got the correct amount, whether it be for the nets or outside. And again, if you are unsure about that, please do liaise with your club welfare officer, who should be completely aware of those ratios. But alternatively, hopefully your coaches should be as well. And just to really reiterate, as well as your qualified coaches, we need to make sure we've got the appropriate amount of adults there as well, present at the session over the age of 18 with a registered DBS. A basic guide, obviously, we know that Foundation 1 coaches are qualified coaches and Level 2. Over the years, we know there's been some slight changes on that, but generally as a hard, fast rule, qualified coaches come under that bracket. In terms of groups rotating round, really do make sure, again, as Rob said, add it into your risk assessment. If we're going to be rotating groups round on the outfield, try and make sure that as a group is working together, that they stay with that coach where they can. If they are required to move around and use the same equipment, make sure that sanitisation process is in place to try and avoid touch points where you can. And it's all about really mitigating that risk to ensure that we can make it safe for everyone involved in our session as possible. And as Rob did allude to, really do make sure you really reflect after your first session, see how it went, and there's nothing wrong with reflecting and realising actually we might need to change something. Takeaway refreshments, there's been quite a lot of chat on this on social media. I know a lot of people have questioned whether we can or cannot do this. We're still waiting on some further guidance on this from ECB as to whether we can have takeaway refreshments. But please do watch this space. We'll try and get some current guidance out to you as to what can take place, because the current guidance from government is that it's takeaway only, and we're trying to avoid people buying stuff and then eating it on site, which then might create a situation where we've got lots of people in that same vicinity, which we're trying to avoid. In terms of gameplay, it's something that we all know would love to get back to as soon as we can. But just to really highlight that as per the current guidance, no matches are able to take place and recreational matches are still suspended. Simple practices that incorporate up to 6 people on the outfield in the nets are completely fine. But in terms of actual gameplay and match play at this point, unfortunately, we still can't do that. As Matt alluded to earlier, as per that roadmap that ECB are looking to produce, hopefully we can get to that next stage as soon as possible. But just whilst we're in this current phase, it is simply practice and training only, and making sure that we do adhere to the ECB guidance that has been released shortly, or has been released currently, sorry. For anyone, if you do want obviously more on coaching, obviously please don't hesitate to get in touch with your local rep. But also in terms of return to activity guidance, it's pages 10 to 12, where there is more information about one-to-one coaching specifically, and also the group coaching. There will be lots of individual questions about how it will work at your club. And we're now going to head over to Ben, who's going to take us through just a few key parts, particularly on that risk assessment. So Dan, do you want to just move forward?
Cool, thanks, Lewis. Just reiterating again, guys, in terms of what's been said on the call already, obviously groups are now able to be up to 6 people, but obviously maintaining the social distancing guidelines at all time. One thing we will say, it's basically up to clubs to be able to risk assess whether they feel comfortable in delivering sessions to up to 6 people. Particularly an example of that is in a net situation with regards to enclosed nets. It might be that the space in the net doesn't allow you to, or you don't feel comfortable with that social distancing with 4 bowlers, a batter and a coach. So it's completely up to you. If you feel that you're not happy with that, then you could use an example of a group of 4, which I'll go on to a little bit later. Simple, there's been some questions in the chat box around activities that can be done. I'd encourage everyone to look at iCoach Cricket. If you haven't logged onto it already, obviously it's a simple process, but if you do have an iCoach Cricket account, there are lots of fielding games, small-sided game practices that you can undertake within your groups that are available to be looked at on there. iCoach Cricket also now has a Twitter feed, which is at iCoach Cricket, and there have been some good examples of small-sided practices on there already. One was a bowling practice, I think it was on yesterday, and there's some good examples of the coach using social distancing and keeping all 5 bowlers interacting and on the move at the same time during the session. So I'd encourage all of you guys to have a look at that, and encourage your coaches as well. There's just an example as well below of the risk assessment, and this one is one that Essex have carried out, and just taking into example any practices that you want to do, we encourage you to have a look at the risk factors that might be taking place and what actions are required to make sure that you're adhering to the guidelines, both the ECB guidelines and the government guidelines around social distancing, including sharing of equipment and the sanity, hand sanity, etc., etc. So please, when you're looking at your sessions and what you can run, please undertake the risk assessment and have a look at potentially any of the mitigations that you might want to put in place to make sure that impact and that risk is low. I've just got a couple of examples here. One, a live example from my club, that is, we have this situation where our net isn't big enough to socially distance 4 bowlers. So one of our practices that we put in place is that it's only a 2-bay net facility, so obviously one of them is out of action. We have a coach in there, a batter and 2 bowlers, and just off to the side we have a small area where the other 2 players are undertaking some conditioning exercises, socially distancing, and we've put it into a scenario sessions where current bowlers will bowl 2 overs each, so 24 balls at the batter, and then those 2 players will leave the net and the other 2 players will come back in and they'll swap into their conditioning, and then that batter will have 48 balls and then they will rotate round. So that's just an example. Another example from another club is that they have decided to continue with just the 1-to-1 net situation and then run some small group sessions under the guidelines on the outfield. An example of that would be potentially 2 groups of 6 people. One is a supervisory adult coach support worker, 5 players in both of the groups, overseen by a qualified coach. Obviously, they've got 3 different bubbles there, the qualified coach on their own and the 2 bubbles, enabling them to do some fielding small group sessions on the outfield. I think we've got a live example on the screen there as well, which has been provided by a club, and obviously you can see that they've split it into time slots and gone from 4, 5, 6, 7 with age groups in each time slot. I think this has come from Wanstead, so if anybody has got any questions or would like some further information around how they've decided to do it, then please pop any details in the Q&A or the chat box and we'll get that passed on to Wanstead, who can provide some further details. I think we are now moving on to just cover a little bit more around the safeguarding. So I'm going to hand over to Phil, who's going to take us through the safeguarding requirements and just some reminders and guidance on those.
Thanks, Ben. And as you heard, some really good examples of how we can establish cricket. And the big thing is that safe hands continues to be the policies and procedures that we all need to adhere to. So we continue to make sure that those people there who are working with a level 2 qualified coach still needs to be DBS checked. If clubs need to get a DBS check, it's a very straightforward process. It's working very efficiently at the moment. They just need to follow the advice from the county reps. We've all become very used to using these Zoom sessions, and just a few points about that, some good practice around the various counties. At the moment, we're saying Zoom meetings should not be recorded unless the club has got written permission from everybody who's actually logged on. Now, that's quite challenging in a way. We've also need to make sure that when you are logging anybody on to a Zoom session, it's the parents and carers who are using their mobiles. One of the things we've actually said is that we want the parents to turn the screen onto themselves before it starts, so we can make sure that kids are not using their own mobiles without any parents. And clearly the most important thing really is that if children are getting involved in coaching sessions, which is a brilliant example, it's following a lot of other good practice from different sports around, then we need to make sure that it's done so in an environment and it's risk assessed, and it's the parents' responsibility to risk assess their own garden if they're using a garden, to make sure that there are no potential accidents, kids falling over bricks, hazards or whatever else. So all of that is available if anybody wants any further information about Zoom meetings. But as I say, I can't stress enough that Safe Hands training for the existing club welfare officer whose issues have run out because they haven't been able to do a face-to-face course. They will be contacted by the ECB over the next week or so, inviting them to an online classroom 2.5-hour training session that will have a 12-month validity. If you as a club have a newly appointed club welfare officer, then you need to let your various county rep know who that is. The county rep will then be able to arrange with the ECB, and they will provide them with an invitation to do that training. Just be patient. That obviously ECB has just come out this week, so it is taking some time to get down. But I know from the fact speaking to people, it is working, and people are being signed up very efficiently for these courses. Also, the Safeguarding and Protecting Children course, SYC, they need to make sure that is kept up to date. And again, it's the ECB safeguarding team that will be able to give appointments for that qualifications. If there is anything when it comes down to working with young people, particularly in a net situation, group coaching situation, you can find Safe Hands very easily. If you just Google ECB Safe Hands, all the policies will come up. So, for instance, I've got the ECB guidelines on supervising children at a cricket session. It's there, it's available, and if you need anything, then you can very quickly understand and bring it up. You might need to use some of this for posters, information on nets to make sure that everybody is complying with good safeguarding child protection practice throughout all the counties. If there's any questions about that later, I'll be more than happy to take them, but I think that's enough for me at the moment. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone else. Just we're going to go on to the questions. Just I see there's a few questions coming up, but just to help you there, following on Phil's point, all of the contact details for the lead officers and for Phil are on the page at the moment, so you can get that. And then just following on from this, just to update you as well, the next wave of webinars are coming forward. So this Thursday, we have one around club development plans, which Simon Cooper, who was the head of sport for London during the time of the Olympics and other major events, is going to help us around that point in terms of developing those plans. We're then going to look at wider community opportunities. And then next week, we've got women and girls cricket. And then following that, we're just confirming, following one of the points that's been raised to me as well is around with the groundsman, because actually now we're looking at that potential getting into stage 3 and potentially step 4. How we have those conversations with our groundsmen around what that looks like and any potential knock-on around end of season work. So it's those kind of conversations as well that are starting to happen within clubs as we go through. So just going back to the panel and looking through the questions. Let's see what we've got here. So both field and perspective and also the younger age group, the government guidelines, just sharing equipment. So Matt, did you just want to confirm around a bit around the small groups on the outfield and like the sharing of equipment and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so so where possible, we want to avoid sharing equipment, and I think the guys covered that quite well earlier, talking about how groups move around the field and move from station to station. So the balls bit has been one that's caused lots of not only chuckles but questions and uncertainty around how that works and how that works. So every child, every participant in the drill should have their own ball, be fed into a mitt. As long as hands are washed beforehand and equipment's washed between sessions, that's reducing the risk as much as possible. And this is all about we can't make this 100% safe. This is all about mitigating as much risk as possible throughout the game. So making sure that all the steps that are in the guidance should be followed, that the cleaning of equipment, the washing of hands, avoiding touching people's faces, saliva on the ball, all those different bits we'll have seen through there. So it's about mitigating that risk as much as possible rather than making it absolutely safe. So I think when it comes to any sort of groups, and there's some mention all there about stumps as well, I think in the questions, it's just about applying some common sense, looking at how you mitigate some of that contact and making sure that you're doing all the steps you can to reduce your participants' risk from any sort of exchange of the virus.
And Matt, while you just there, did you want to pick up, just building on from Lewis's point, in the conversations going on around the refreshments bit? Just been a couple of bits.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of there's a lot of questions have landed since the guidance came out on clubs opening up for takeaway, and it was absolutely right. The takeaway guidance is for restaurants, hotels. It's not something directed necessarily at the volunteer sector. So from our position, we're talking about groups of 6 or clusters of groups of 6 in a club. We don't see that as a huge step forward for a volunteer-led club environment or majority club. So for me, it's about the clubs making their own call. Is it worth going through that to sell 5 cups of coffee to the parents that come down that are then going to go and sit in their car and drink it? So the measures that you have to put in place, the steps that you're going to have to put in place within the clubhouse to open up any sort of facility for retail are going to be quite significant. So it's a very simple kind of cost-benefit analysis to undertake. Is it worth the hassle and process of putting that in place to open up for takeaway? Dan's been given the advice, quite rightly, of chatting to local authorities. If there is a bigger infrastructure and something that's worthwhile and feasible, then that's absolutely fine, and take your own look at the guidance. But for most clubs, it will be relatively small scale at the moment until we start moving back to bigger numbers.
There was a question around, if we have 2 groups of 5, can we play a match of softball cricket? Fletch, have you got an answer to that one?
Yeah, I can. Can people hear me? Because I've been on mute.
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, mate.
Hi, ladies and gents. Well, the answer's no. No games. It's pretty simple. We can't play them. It was quite explicit in the roadmap that had been shown in one of the documents. I know it's not completely official yet, but it's just no games at the moment. And someone has put a question about when are we likely, if you're optimistic, to get to stage 4? I might as well pick the lottery numbers. It was fairly well described earlier that this could go back and forth depending on how the rate of infection or whatever stat the government's using. So we don't know. We could be back at stage 2 after this weekend. We could be back at stage 1 in 2 weeks if there's a huge increase in coronavirus. So we all want to get to stage 4 and ultimately end up playing proper cricket again. But, you know, it's just a guesswork. So no games at the moment until instructed. And unfortunately, everything else would be a guess, I'm afraid.
Phil, thanks.
Yes.
Phil, there's one around, I don't know if you might help around safeguarding, around public parks and setting up around public parks and sort of insurance and that point around making sure there's risk mitigation and possible if you're walking through parks, because parks become very popular. Do you have any bits around that point?
I think the biggest thing around parks is particularly if you're using nets where the ball could be hit out some distance, could be picked up by other people, picked up by dogs. I think that's going to be a really big, it's going to be up to the level 2 DBS checked coach to do a risk assessment wherever they are. And that may change during the day. That might vary in terms of people around. But I think the one thing we've got to avoid is to get any of the sort of bad news stories which will be seized upon. And if cricket kind of show it's a responsibly run sport, then I think we've got a problem. We could be even longer before we get back. So I think if everybody takes it seriously, hopefully we're going to stop some of these games that have been played on parks. I think it's, you know, our responsibility is to make sure that cricket can be seen to be a sport that's delivering recreational activities for young people responsibly. And if everybody complies with the guidelines, I mean, today's work from all the guys there, the risk assessments, the advice is absolutely first class. So if anybody is not certain, certainly the slides, forward the slides onto people, check out Safe Hands and make sure we all comply with the regulations.
Dan, just on that parks piece, if I can, I think just reiterating that back to what we said about the nets, this isn't a you have to do this, this is if it's right to do so. So just taking that pause and saying, is it safe for us to run these training sessions if the park's going to be attended by the public and going to have huge openings and groups on the public space? So how would you normally do that on a Friday night or your usual training night, and look at those measures and how you'd put them in place? And if you can't do it safely, you don't have to do it. This isn't a dictation from the ECB for you to open up your club for groups of 6 to train. It's when it's safe for you to do so within your own environments.
Great, thanks, Matt. And did you just want to pick up on a bit around All-Stars and Dynamos as well?
Yeah, so in terms of national programmes, All-Stars in particular, we are looking at what that looks like during the summer. There was some conversations around whether that works in a group of 6. The intention of All Stars was always around large groups of kids coming together and having a great time, not just doing cricket for the sake of it. So until we can get until those groups allow us to do bigger groups than just 6, then All Stars will remain postponed, and we'll update as and when we know, kind of moving forward into steps 4 and 5, as we talked about earlier. All Stars will be picked up on that, but we expect that to be later on in the summer.
Thanks. And Ben, just one final, there was a coach ed one there just to wrap up. If someone's going through their current level 2 and haven't done their assessment, can they still support a group alongside that?
If they have taking in the example of if they could supervise a group of 5 children under the guidance of another level 2 coach, for the example. So if you had a level 2 coach and you had then 2 groups separate, the coach could be in the middle socially distancing, and the 2 groups further apart socially distancing with a supervisor and 5 children. Those coaches undertaking their level 2s could be the supervisory adult within those groups of 6, yes.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. So if the other questions we'll pick up and we'll come back to independent. I see there's a few around, they'll get picked up more around the gameplay. Like I said, just to reinforce, we're at stage 3 at the moment. It's small group activity, looking into it. You've seen some ways and ideas. We can help out with any of the templates that people have asked for, so please drop us an email if you want those templates. Like I said, the lead officers are here, we can help you around those points. And then hopefully collectively we still keep working as a game and the community, we can get close to that step 4 point where actually adaptive games will come through. And I know there's plenty of meetings going on with the leagues over the next couple of weeks around what that might look like as we go forward, and there'll be more information, and we'll certainly, as we get that information, we'll look to run another webinar to keep you updated. But currently it's around, let's try and help to reactivate our clubs, get people back playing safely and supporting our communities. And again, please just stay in touch if you've got any other questions. But thank you again to the whole panel, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us this evening. Stay safe. Thank you.